Hello, thank you for joining us and welcome to this discussion about cultivating research opportunities for curators and our colleagues, hosted by AAMC, AAMC Foundation, and the AAMC Career Support Committee. The panelists' bios have been shared in advance and also will be posted on the AAMC website, so we'll keep the introductions brief. I'm Robin Clark, Director of the Artist Initiative at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and I'm joined by Sarah Kianovsky, Curator of the Collection at Harvard University Art Museums, and by Lucía Sanromán, Director of Visual Arts at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts here in San Francisco. It's our hope that the issues and case studies shared here will be helpful both to you and to those whom you're mentoring. As we go along, please feel free to submit questions via the dashboard in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, and I will share questions with the panelists toward the end of each of their presentations. This webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on the AAMC website, www.artcurators.org, where you can also view past professional development webinars. Let's start with Sarah. Sarah, can you tell us what research means in the context of your museum and how you're cultivating research opportunities for your colleagues and for your students?
Sure. Thank you, Robin, and thanks for inviting me to participate in the panel today. I should say that I'm actually curator of the collection for modern and contemporary art, not for the entire collection. We have 3 curatorial divisions here, actually 4. One of them is for academic and public programming, and there's a curator of the collection for each of the 3 collecting parts of the division. The thing about the Harvard Art Museums is obviously we're an encyclopedic museum, but we're based in a university setting. And so I think we probably have some things in common with each of the sort of mentoring institutions, but also there's a lot of differences in terms of our audience and what our resources are. So the first thing to know, I guess, is that our new space allows for larger scale temporary exhibitions than we've really had before, as well as a variety of small format exhibition spaces. And preparing for those is probably the primary research task of each of the senior curators at the museums, aside from managing permanent collection installations. We're a fairly small curatorial staff for the size of our collections. There are, I think, 10 or 12 curators for 250,000 objects. And when you consider the breadth of our university responsibilities, historically, making time for exhibition research has been pretty difficult. We've made a couple of changes in the last several years to mitigate that difficulty, and I thought I'd mention those practical tweaks first before I talked about some of the other ways we do research. The first is that we're on an academic calendar, and so curators who are working on temporary exhibitions are encouraged to take research and writing time in the summer when possible, since there's a lot less of an academic demand then. And so it's not unusual for people to do a 4 to 6 week research stint away from the museum. For the last couple of summers, we've also tried to suspend all of our acquisition and loan meetings for the entire summer, which anyone who's tried to borrow something from us knows, because we don't answer your loan requests. But it does help to facilitate that. And then what happens is that if something comes up that can't wait, we can do an off-cycle meeting. But generally, we just postpone everything until September, when everybody comes back to campus. During the school year, we've also been trying to limit our standing meetings to between Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, so that people can theoretically use Mondays and Fridays as writing days. Of course, this is all easier for us because all of the research libraries are just a stone's throw away from us. We don't need to travel to do that kind of research. Although those of us who've been here for a long time are still complaining about the fact that the Fine Arts Library isn't actually in the building anymore, and we have to go outside to get to the books. We've also made another sort of structural switch from having assistant curators who work on everything to instead bringing on advanced fellows, usually people who are ABD or postdocs, for 1 or 2 year stints for specific exhibition or publication projects that are being spearheaded by the senior curators. These fellows all have some day-to-day responsibilities, but in terms of collection care and research and help with new acquisitions. But since they're brought on primarily for these special exhibitions or projects, we can hire for a much narrower expertise than we might have been able to if we were hiring an assistant curator for a longer term. So for example, Melissa Venator, who started this year, is a specialist in the Bauhaus. And since we're doing an exhibition to mark the 100th anniversary of the Bauhaus and the Bauhaus at Harvard in 2019, we were able to hire someone with that much narrower expertise. And that's really helpful for us, in part because it frees up the curator of the exhibition to do more research and writing. Often the fellows are involved in planning adjunct programming, so film series, contributing to research websites, other things that are meant to go along with a bigger exhibition. And that it just balances the work a lot for the curators. The day-to-day collections research is managed by the curator of the collection, so that's me. And then I also have a curatorial assistant, and then we have help from fellows and students. And so that's sort of how that work gets balanced out. Those of you who've been here know that we've incorporated works on paper into all of our permanent collection galleries. And so everyone contributes to those rotations that happen every 6 months or so in each of our galleries. And so there's research involved in that as well. But the permanent collection, because the non-rotating parts of it don't move as frequently, that gives us more time for research as well. Our new facilities also have 3 temporary galleries that are devoted to university teaching, including one that we're hoping is going to be the site of faculty and curator collaboration. Currently, 2 of those galleries, just in the last month or so, are devoted to an exhibition called Drawing as a Modern Medium. And that's an exhibition that's the result of collaboration between print curator Elizabeth Rudy and Professor Eva Lacher-Burkhardt. And it also involved a couple years worth of Eva's students, which Elizabeth helped to teach her classes. And the students helped to select objects for this exhibition and also wrote texts for an online tool that accompanies the show. Another site of research and collaboration here is the Strauss Center for Conservation. A lot of our exhibitions involve a conservation component, like our opening exhibition on the Rothko murals. And conservation fellows often collaborate with curatorial staff on their fellowship projects because they come, for a year or 2, and they need to do a project as part of finishing their degree. For example, last year, Andrea von Hettenstrom, who is a paintings conservator trainee, undertook a project on our Franz Marc Grazing Horses 4 in the course of readying the painting for loan to the Franz Marc Museum. And in the end, she was able to collaborate with Lynette Roth, who's the curator of the Bush Reisinger Museum. And they put together an essay for the exhibition catalog that sort of reported on some of the research that they'd done together. We also are encouraging faculty and students from across the university to use the collection for their teaching. And it's much broader than it used to be. I've been here for a long time. And in the beginning, it was really mostly art and architecture professors and maybe the occasional studio art professor who used the collection. But now, just this week, I met with a junior tutorial on fascism that was taught by a professor of government, a professor of Romance languages who needs help identifying work supporting her teaching on gender and identity in contemporary Spain, is coming by this afternoon, and I'm going to help her select works that might support that teaching. And tomorrow I'm meeting with a class on 20th century art and politics across the Atlantic. So the fascism class looked at a selection of works on paper ranging from John Hartfield's photo montages to Otto Dix's war portfolio. And then we went to the galleries where we looked at examples of work that was subject to the Nazi purge of degenerate art. The course on art and politics is, I think, going to be focusing on post-war art and its role in the Cold War. And I don't know yet exactly what the Spanish professor wants to see, but that's just 1 week out of a semester. So we have, we deal with people from all across the university. A lot of these professors will create object-based assignments for their courses. And so we'll have students and faculty both returning to the collection, coming to use curatorial files, making panic calls to curators at 5 o'clock on Friday, asking for help for the paper that's due Monday. But there's a lot more use of the collection, and it really encourages us to go back to the collections to look at them differently. And I think in the end, it also informs what we put into our permanent collection galleries, the way that we shape the themes that are there, the resources that we have access to across the university to get other viewpoints on the works in our collection.
That's fantastic. Does anyone in the audience have questions for Sarah? We'll give them a moment to think about that, and I'll get to take this chance to ask you some questions myself.
Right.
You mentioned an online tool. Could you explain what that looks like?
So we've been developing a series of online tools. Some of them are sort of research, not really databases, but focused ways of getting at our collections database. Our entire collection is available online with basically whatever information we have in TMS can be seen online. So you can see bibliography, exhibition history, provenance, stuff like that. But there are only certain ways that you can get at it. And since the collection is so large, it's a little bit unwieldy. And so what we've done is for different projects, we've created these separate ways to access it. Sometimes they're called special collections. So a great example is the new Bauhaus Special Collections site, which was put together by Rob Wiesenberger, who's a grad student at NYU and was here as a fellow for 2 years. And he went through this entire enormous Bauhaus collection and broke it up into themes, wrote introductory essays for parts of it so that you could go into it. And if you wanted to look at everything having to do with textiles or everything having to do with a particular artist or with publications or graphic design, you could get at it that way, which is something that our general collection search doesn't really allow for the general public. But we've also used it to create sort of little mini tours. So, you know, we have, again, the Bauhaus collection, there's one sort of tour for that. You can look at the light space modulator and watch a video of it running. We have one that was a collaboration with the Strauss Center that looks at different objects around the museum that allow us to demonstrate the interactions between art and science. So these are things that we can develop sort of on a shorter time frame. We have templates that we can put things into. I'm working on one right now that is going to accompany the Christopher Wilmarth show that we're doing this summer. Our Wilmarth collection includes all of his studio files. Wilmarth kept a file for every sculpture he created, and it includes not just photographs and diagrams, but often instructions on how to put the work together. And because we have them, we're often the source for owners of Wilmarth sculptures. They come to us and ask, what's in the file? How do we construct the work? And so one of the things that we decided to do with this website was to make it possible for people to do that without us having to go pull the files. So we scanned all of the studio files, and they'll be part of that. And I actually have this wonderful undergraduate who's putting it together for us. And it'll all be available when the exhibition goes up. But it will also allow us to include information on the symposium and an exhibition and an extended essay by a graduate student. All sorts of other information can be put into there. So there's just we're using them in different ways depending on the project. There's a couple, I think that all of the student labels for the drawing as a modern medium are available in an online tool as well. So it's a sort of a flexible medium.
That's really great. I think we'll move on to Lucía. Lucía, maybe in contrast to the kind of encyclopedic academic collection that Sarah's talking about, would you talk a bit about what research means at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, and how you prioritize research amidst all the other demands that you have there in terms of producing exhibitions and public programs.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Robin, for the invitation, and also AAMC for making this possible. I think that Sarah's answer points to two different struggles that we all share across different types of institutions, which is the demands on our time, the demands to our desire to produce new knowledge, coupled with simply putting exhibitions up. I think the enemy of research are the meetings. We all have a culture of meetings. This is actually probably abusive at a certain point. But this is a long-running problem that is shared. What is not shared necessarily is what you point to, which is that Yerba Buena Center for the Arts is a non-collecting institution focused on contemporary art for the gallery presentation, but we also are a multi-disciplinary center. So there is a Department of Performance, a Department of Civil Engagement, a Department of Film. Historically, the exhibitions that have been produced here have been produced along thematic group shows. The former curator saw them as an opportunity, yes, for research, which was presented in the form of catalogs. Research on topics that were urgent or of the moment. What I have done is I take a slightly different approach. I feel like that creates a kind of episodic approach to research that's very hard for us to then, as curators of contemporary art, to kind of deepen our approach. We, particularly if you're doing, for example, the latest trend, or not even the latest trend, let's be generous, and a series of excellent artists whose projects are related but different. Sometimes what happens is that we seem to always be starting and ending with a certain type of practice. What I've done is I proposed essentially two approaches to how we program at YBCA. One is focused on city and urbanism, architecture and design. It's a much smaller program. And the second is focused on essentially what is broadly and sometimes unfairly described as social practice, or artists who are engaged in the social. That provides us with very broad parameters. The largest, the heavier, most long-term projects that I am involved in terms of research are a series of 4 exhibitions, really, over 4 to 5 years, on the work of women artists whose practices span a variety of approaches that, yes, definitely you can kind of have a core around the notion of social practice, but broadly thought through. And these would be Lynn Hirschman-Leeson, which is not an exhibition that I have curated. We just opened it, but I see it as the start, followed by Tania Bruguera, followed by Future Farmers, followed by Susan Lacey and Andrea Bowers. What that gives us is an opportunity in 5 or 6 years to really do a kind of compare and contrast approach, and to develop sharper and sharper tools to actually do the research on artists that are fairly hard to both present and to kind of understand with our tools as art historians and as contemporary curators. These are artists, including Lynn, it's actually interesting to think of the fact that the exhibition we just opened is a traveling show that has been radically altered for our space. So we use their research as a kind of script to make a different physical presentation. But as a small team, we are myself and then basically 2 assistants, curatorial associates, and then production staff. We are 7 people. What it gives us is a very solid start for us to develop the tools to try to balance the research and the production, because we do everything. We don't have the capacity or the relationships per se internal to the institution to have the university's resources. So on the one hand, the idea is that over the course of many years, we as a group become more adept at simply balancing, and also sharpen our intellectual and our methodological tools to describe these different practices differently for each of them, because they require different approaches. There is a broad difference between Tania Bruguera's political gestures and her interventions into institutions, and Susan Lacey's more activist approaches. And rather activist, really, it's more community organizing and sociology-based approaches. So that starts to give us a much better way both to understand and to fine-tune how we address this as a small team. The second thing we do is that we are actually very collaborative how we approach this. So for example, Susan Lacey is not an exhibition that I'm doing on my own. We are collaborating with SF MOMA as two institutions, but also collaborating as curators with Dominic Wilsdon and Rudolph Freeling. That's a public practice curator and a new media curator on a project that requires all of our different skills. Mm-hmm. We're also doing a public research process for that with a Warhol Foundation grant that SF MOMA applied for, that we thankfully obtained, which has two prongs. One is with social practice projects, one of the biggest challenges we have from our history is that we don't really have the appropriate tools to describe the social aspect. Anthropology, ethnography, sociology gives us, and public history disciplines gives us that approach, but we either collaborate with people in those disciplines or we figure out a way to include them in our toolkit methodologies of description. What we are doing is that we are essentially working with a public historian and a person who worked with Suzanne over the 10 years that she did a specific project here in the Bay Area called the Oakland Projects, to lead the social and the public aspect of the kind of investigation on her practice in the Bay Area. So that is not actually led by an art historian, but is led by a person from a different spectrum. And the goal of that is to both be accurate in the description of what actually happened, but also to narrate the network that made possible such complex, socially engaged projects. That's one end. On the other end, we are also convening a group of curators of time-based practices, not just social practice, but performance and so on, in New York actually next week, in a private and then slightly public gathering where we will present to each other what we have done and how we have approached the different complexities. So for example, we have curators who do performance art specifically. And we also have curators who have done projects in social practice as a retrospective format. The goal of this is to do a kind of phased public approach to research. Because of course, one of the aspects of this, which is interesting in the way that Sarah described the Harvard's approach, is that because it is an education center primarily, all research is in a way public. But oftentimes as art historian curators in institutions that are isolated from those environments, our research is, I'm sorry, I think I meant to say all research is public at Harvard. But in our case, most of the research we do oftentimes is very private research. We do it with a number of people and then it's unveiled through the catalog and through the exhibition. So we're trying to figure out ways to socialize the project differently and to be much more porous and inclusive in terms of how that is presented and in what phase. And really more than presented is how it's actually developed. In other words, that the research is fundamentally important to the way that the exhibition is finalized. That's different from what I'm doing for Tania Bruguera's exhibition, which opens in the summer. We have an exhibition and we have a catalog. The catalog has traditional curator's text. It has a glossary because she uses terminology as a form of also of redress of certain political issues or art historical aesthetic issues. But we are also using another type of collaboration for that, which is that we're doing a school of useful art, or arte útil, which is one of the topics that she develops. That's less research and much more simply utilizing the platform of the institution as part of the artist's toolkit. In other words, we put ourselves at the service of the artist in that case. The research that is actually quite hard to do is the more analytic research, which I find delicious and comforting in a way that this more experimental projects with these intense artists are, because there is more risk in certain ways in doing a school in the galleries for 8 weeks than in presenting your beautifully crafted and wonderfully sort of thought through analysis of something. So in a way, I am hoping that in 4 or 5 years we can have a different discussion, and I can actually tell you this is what we found as a group, of attempting to do a deeper kind of engagement from the perspective of an art center, which is naturally designed to be presenting always the best, the latest and latest. And another thing I would note is that there is definitely also an approach here that has been influenced by a lot of ideas from Mexico, Central America, and South America. Mexico being North America, as we all know. I am Mexican, so therefore there is a kind of approach to research that is decolonized, is described as decolonized. What that means is that always taking a position of the subaltern, or taking a position of trying to test the limits of the discipline itself through the point of view that is external to the discipline. And that is also another reason why I think that sometimes I personally struggle, but definitely constantly learn from the inclusion of other disciplines into our toolkit.
Yeah. Wow, that is heady stuff. There's a question, it's a lengthy one, I'm gonna read it to you. It says, collaborations can be incredibly fruitful. They can also present many unforeseen challenges that can take time away from doing good research, particularly when the institutions or organizations have different mission statements, budget capacities, staffing availability. What insights would you offer for curators and institutions who want to collaborate to avoid potential pitfalls?
Do you want me to try to answer that?
Yes, the question is for you.
It's for me. I see. Okay. Well, I will say that I try not to think of the pitfalls, because the moment I am actually probably, I am incredibly pessimistic. Basically, I am an optimist that hides in its heart a complete pessimism, which means that if I start to think about the pitfalls, I will start to really fear, and I will actually start to design the process to control it, which I think is the least appropriate way. I think it's the talking cure. A lot of the projects that we do in contemporary practice, and a lot of these projects that are social projects, require you to constantly be in communication with others and to be clarifying things. I would say the biggest tool you can use here is really like almost therapy, honestly. Mm-hmm. So there are pitfalls, but clarity at all points with your partners. Even it's just like a family. You just have to talk with through the issues, because one thing that I find is that when I start to think about what the institution might find problematic, I actually push that problem further than if I don't think about in an institutional way, because I almost bring the spirit from wherever it is. So far, for example, with collaboration with SF-MOMA has been very, very fruitful. We've had no problems so far, thankfully, and I don't believe we will. We are very different institutions in size and in budget. So as long as we keep and in resources, in other words, all the staffing that SF-MOMA has, and they are of course just across the street. So we just have to keep that in mind so that we don't expect the wrong things from each other. I'm trying to think of any real problems I've had, and I'm sure there are many, but I don't hold on to them.
Communication is essential. That's the takeaway.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think at this point, I'll share a little information about the Artist Initiative at SF-MOMA, and then we can have a little more discussion. So thank you, Lucía. So as a counterpoint to the programs at Harvard and YBCA, I'd like to share a little information about the Artist Initiative, a collection research grant at SF-MOMA that's funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. We do, in fact, combine aspects of Sarah's program by teaching from the collection and aspects of Lucia's program by collaborating intensively with living artists. I would say that SF MOMA has been working for some time to understand what it might mean to collect an artist's practice as well as their work, which entails developing long-term dialogues where possible with the artists in our collection. The Artist Initiative is a 5-year grant. We're midway through. And at the moment, we're bringing together a team of curators, conservators, and scholars to study the work of Via Selmans in depth in preparation for a retrospective exhibition that's being co-organized by SF MOMA and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This will open at SF MOMA in a little under 2 years and travel to New York. So as an example, the SF MOMA Artist Initiative Via Selmans team includes internally Senior Curator Gary Garles, Assistant Curator Nancy Lim, Michelle Barger, who's Head of Conservation, Paula De Cristoforo, who is our Paintings Curator, Amanda Hunter-Johnson, who is our Paper Conservator, Rachel Faust, who's the Manager of the Artist Initiative, Ben Peters, our Senior Preparator and colleague at the Collection Center, Chris Kertzia, our Graduate Intern for the Artist Initiative, and myself. Over the next 2 years, the team's meeting with the artist, studying her work in public and private collections, and convening a colloquium at SF MOMA, which will include guests from the Met, the Modern, the Getty, University College in London, and an independent scholar. During the colloquium, we'll discuss Selman's work, thinking about her place in various narratives of modern and contemporary art history, and explore what it means to produce a retrospective with an artist who has a very active ongoing practice. There's always the problem of resisting interpretive closure, letting it still breathe and be open, even though we're trying to do something which is on some level definitive. That's a tension in the project. It's always a goal to engage colleagues across departments in this conversation, but with the daily demands of maintaining the museum, we find that's not always possible. The Mellon Grant is allowing us, in fact, requiring us to carve out time for this project and to assess our default responses to the process. It provides professional development opportunities to all involved, including the fellows and interns who are key participants in the project. In addition to the 5 artist engagements supported by the Artist Initiative, of which the Via Selmans research is one, a few of the others included a project with Ellsworth Kelly, which resulted in a beautiful installation of his work in the galleries when the museum opened last year, shortly after his death, and with media artist Julia Scher, with whom we collaborated to reimagine a piece that she'd made first for the museum back in 1993. The funds are also allowing us to test and develop an approach to team teaching from the collection at our Collection Center, a new research and art storage facility in South San Francisco. The Collection Center features a mock-up gallery, which is a full-scale copy of one of the galleries in the Snøhetta-designed expansion of SF MOMA. And this gallery is located right in the heart of the vault, in close proximity to the collection and also adjacent to our conservation studio. In this space, we host sessions ranging from studies of objects laid out somewhat casually on tables to seminars where students have the opportunity to access really ambitious installations of major works. After 2 semesters of a small pilot program, we went public with this and did an open call to Bay Area educators to propose object study sessions at the Collection Center that would significantly enhance their curricula. This project has provided new and fruitful opportunities to build relationships in the higher education community and internally amongst our education, curatorial, conservation, and other departments. After reviewing the proposals, we selected the ones that seemed to benefit most from access not only to our collection, but to our staff expertise, and folks who were interested in a kind of workshop approach to what these learning opportunities might look like. We then worked with the professors to craft a checklist for their study session and also to discuss approaches to teaching their class in tandem with SF MOMA's curators, conservators, art handlers, and members of the Artist Initiative team. Sometimes the object study sessions at the Collection Center are bundled with a tour of the facility, which students in which students have an opportunity to meet members from across our staff. And this is a wonderful opportunity for them to understand in a more substantial way what goes on behind the scenes at museums, and also to imagine what different career opportunities might be for them. Most members of the public are familiar with curators, with docents, maybe tour guides, and other kind of public-facing staff at the museum, but this is often students' first opportunities to understand what it might be to be a registrar or to be a preparator, to be involved with handling the art in any way, researching the work. So we've had a lot of positive feedback from students who are learning what paths for them might be beyond the most visible ones. So sometimes there are facility tours and sometimes not, bundled with the object studies. To date, we've had classes from Stanford, California College of the Arts, San Francisco Art Institute, the University of San Francisco, several of the UCs, including Berkeley and Davis, Mills College, and California State East Bay. Next month, an art history graduate seminar is traveling here from Columbia University, which is our first expansion beyond the Bay Area. And they're coming to explore works by artists based in California in our collection. We'll have an intensive study day for that. We most often serve art history, studio art, and museum studies students, although recently we hosted pre-med students in a medical humanities course who are considering constructions of health and illness in contemporary art as a pathway to discussing wellness with patients from different cultures. And that conversation was really extraordinary. Each of these students, there are about 30 of them, are doing a project as part of their coursework where they're engaging with some community in the Bay Area with which they feel an affiliation. And so it really does highlight the diversity of the folks who are living here, and thinking about these questions through visual art was really helpful to the students. It also presented an opportunity for our staff to think about the collection in a way that most of us haven't. The session was led by Professor Jason Smith, together with curatorial assistant Jared Ledesma in our painting and sculpture department, who wrote his thesis on Felix Gonzalez Torres, Heather Brown, who's our new fellow in conservation of contemporary art, Nicholas Schaffen, who's a preparator here at the Collection Center, who's worked with several of the artists whose work was featured in the installation, including Jim Hodges and A.A. Bronson, Rachel Faust, as I mentioned before, and myself. So it really is a 360-degree learning experience for us, where those of us teaching the session learn as much from the students as the students do, I think, themselves. Most of these students had little prior experience with visual art. For example, only 2 out of 30 of them had previously visited the museum. But they're now much more attuned to it, and having found a personal connection, they're keen to keep exploring. The classes are helping us think about ways of integrating research and teaching into a broad range of our museum activities. So we are really grateful to have had the chance to be a little bit experimental within our own context. So at this point, I'll ask if anyone has questions for me or for Lucía or Sarah. The floor is open. While we're waiting on that, I'd like to ask Lucía, how do you think about publishing in terms of your research program?
We are working on the first publication that will be launched with Tania Bruguera's exhibition. There are 2 aspects of it. There are various aspects of it. We have very limited financial resources, really, honestly. We're an art center. The institution has always produced catalogs under the previous director. The catalogs were primarily maybe once a year. There will be one catalog produced, again, as an exhibition catalog functions, presenting the work of the artist and a few essays. We are producing a series of smaller books, really, for this series of exhibitions, of related exhibitions. They are going to have less of the character of a coffee table book catalog and more of the character of, I wouldn't say academic, because they are not necessarily, the essays are not necessarily academic. They don't go through the process of editing of an academic text and the peer review of an academic text. But they certainly have a variety of very engaged and well-known authors. So Tanya's exhibition catalog has essays by Grant Kester. It has an interview between her and Susan Lacey. It has an essay by myself. It has an essay by Cuauhtemoc Medina, who's a Mexican curator who's worked with her before, and Peggy Phelan, who discusses the performance aspect of the work. And then it has really in-depth section text written by Susie Cantor, our curatorial associate, about each of the projects. And this is where it gets interesting, because we are actually doing a much more a kind of narrative history of the projects, rather than an interpretative text that we would normally do in a curatorial text, or a very historically in-depth analysis. It's actually based on interviews with her. So we have to figure out now the tools to actually describe that approach, so that it's not confused with a definitive, incredibly in-depth analysis from various perspectives. Because the artist is so involved with this project, her voice is very present throughout. That's certainly not going to be the case with Suzanne's approach, which will have, frankly, not only 3 curators, but I think that the kind of luxury of time, we have already been working on it for a year, whereas Tanya's is only a year. It's going to be a process of a year and 4 months or something like this. So it's again a form of an approach that allows us to test different ways of doing things. Hopefully by the time we get to Andrea Bowers in 2020, we will have it all perfectly down. All the catalogs will be the same in format, except probably the collaboration with SF-MOMA. I don't think that it will be the same. Mm-hmm. I have a question for Sarah.
Sure.
And I think also that sometimes I am intrigued that always when we mention collaboration, particularly in social practice, many times we think of conflict, or we think of a disagreement, or we think of things that might not be exactly as expected. But I would imagine that, and you will probably have so much experience in researching in larger museum institutions, that can actually happen internally as well, right? That's one. It's not only about an external collaboration, but it can happen internally oftentimes. And so there is a question there about how to deal with that, but also what happens when the researcher or fellow that you have hired to work on something finds things that you're not super comfortable with?
It's interesting that you bring this up, because I was actually just thinking that I also have a question for both of you about collaboration, especially when you're collaborating with people from outside the museum or outside the discipline, which is this question of how we can collaborate and be open to new ideas and somehow still maintain that sense of curatorial authority. And for us, especially when we're working with faculty on exhibitions, there are things that we know about how objects act in space that they, just might not be familiar with. And so there's always a little bit of a dance in those negotiations, I think. In terms of fellows or interns, I mean, if what they find is factual, that's always, I mean, I always tell in my, another part of my life is doing World War II provenance research. And I always tell people we're limited by the facts. We can't make something, if there's information that points in one direction or another, we have to follow it in the direction that the facts point in. So I guess it would depend on what sort of thing a fellow or intern was turning up. They generally work under the direction of whoever's spearheading the exhibition. And so, they have assignments. They're asked to work on a particular aspect of the exhibition. Beyond that, I suppose anytime somebody turns up information that nobody's expecting, there's always that negotiation that has to happen when the information shows up. But I'm trying to think of a time when it's happened. I mean, it might actually happen more with conservation than with the art historians.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So what was your question, Sarah?
So my question was that question of this balance between the expertise that we have as curators and as object-based art historians when we're working with other people who either aren't art historians at all or who just don't have the same relationship to objects. We also collaborate a lot with the Visual and Environmental Studies department. They're right next door to us. And these are, the people who are teaching studio art here, but their relationship with objects is different from ours too. We're, especially as a collecting museum, we have responsibilities for long-term care and maintenance that aren't necessarily their priorities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I find that, when I've worked on projects with them, those are issues that we need to sort of hash out.
I'm trying to remember a specific case, and I will say that I think anthropologists sometimes, because I work or I present work to anthropologists, or have now we're working with a public historian, for example. I think so oftentimes people in other disciplines tend to have a lot of suspicion about our approach to their discipline. Of course, as we would if they were trying to do art history. So that is not so much a story of conflict, but a story of actually seeing what tools we can exchange, what is fruitful to exchange. Anthropologists in particular seem to have both a kind of, they probably have more tools that we can share or more approaches that we share, but they also think that, this is just my sort of perceptual opinion, is that somehow they feel that because we are essentially, our priority is to work with the object and work with the artist, that we sometimes are not as thorough as we should be in describing the social history. And that once the artist as a document, let's say, or the artist as knowledge, or the object as knowledge is released into the social, that it has connotations that we can't really appropriately describe with our language, which is probably true. But I think that then my kind of question back to them is often, because the question comes down really to what is most realistic. What is the most realistic representation of something in the narratives that we use to describe social histories? And I would suggest to them that they are equally valid. That's my only possibility. They are equally valid. We need both approaches in order to actually give the proper measure of something. The other issue that Robin pointed to is that I work with live artists all the time. And that's probably the trickiest negotiation, particularly doing retrospectives for this specific thing that you discussed with the Villaselmins, which is the kind of resistance to closing a narrative. Can you speak to that a little bit, Robin?
Well, sure. I mean, it's still kind of early days with this project. Even in a month or two after we are on the other side of the colloquium and some really robust study days that we're doing soon in New York, I would have a more detailed answer. Right now, it's more hypothetical, which is how do you present something that aims on one level to be relatively definitive without making it seem like it's the end for this artist. I mean, I think it's a common, it's certainly not specific to Villaselmins, it's a common issue with artists kind of being ambivalent about having retrospectives because they always want to imagine that the best is still to come, and it doesn't want to feel like closing a chapter. mean, I think that's as much as I can say about it right now. I think in my, in previous positions, for example, when I was a curator at the St. Louis Art Museum working on a project series, typically with younger artists making new work, in that curatorial situation, I was more of a producer, co-producer with the artist of the projects. And I know you've often played that role. And then when you work with artists, with artists work when the artists are no longer living, and you're playing more of a role of an historian, that's a different role. But those roles become conflated when you do a retrospective with a living artist, or when you do a major exhibition with senior artists, because you need to both collaborate with them and involve them, and yet you're historicizing them at the same time.
That's right.
And it's an interesting and complicated endeavor, and it's different with each person, right? Well, let me ask a question to both of you, which is, how are the ways that your research projects providing professional development opportunities for both for people at different stages in their careers at your institutions?
So I think for us, I mean, because we're a training, I mean, literally a training ground, we have undergraduates who get to work on projects occasionally, and but they're often only here for a semester or 2 semesters before they move on to something else. So that in terms of undergraduates, it's mostly about just giving them a sense of what the field is like, what the work is like. For graduate students, we have these 2-day-a-week internship fellowships that are for people who are done with their coursework. So, and they're in lieu of being a teaching fellow. So it also means that it depends on whether or not the art history department needs more teaching fellows or not. If they have to choose, they'll go with what their advisor is asking them to do, which makes perfect sense. But when they're available, then we have them working on projects, and they get a longer term opportunity to see how an exhibition gets put together, or how a collection gets put together or managed, depending on which projects they're working on. So, for example, Olivia Crow, who's a graduate student in the Visual Environmental Studies department, worked with my colleague Lynette Roth on and created a film series to accompany a Wolfgang Tillmans show that we did earlier this year. She helped with the exhibition itself. It was a piece that we acquired from Tillmans called Folding Refraction Touch, and then she helped Lynette select related objects that were exhibited with it by other artists. But then her primary project was to come up with a film series to accompany it. And so it gave her more of a sense both of how exhibitions get put together, but also just what needs to be done on a day-to-day basis. And then the really advanced fellows who are here for a year or two full-time really get sort of a taste of everything. They get, there's a seminar that they meet with the other fellows on a regular basis. And then they have the project that they were hired to work on, but they also help to staff the Art Study Center, which is where, it's like a drawing study room, but it's for everything in our collection. And I know that in the last year, I think we brought 40,000 objects up there over the course of the year. So, I mean, it's a really busy place. And they are sometimes helping with visits to see things that are within their area of expertise, and sometimes not. And given the way most museums work, the ability to be a generalist is an important skill too.
Lucía?
Well, because we are a small team, the opportunities for people on staff, really. I am the director. I'm also the chief curator, and really only full curator. Susie Cantor is the curatorial associate, but she acts as the assistant curator for the Tania Bruguera show and a few others in the future. And then I also provide, we just had been given the opportunity to apply for a Mellon Foundation Fellow, which we have shaped as a position that can go to either a PhD in community organizing or public history, because we feel it's a skill that we really need to have in the department for 2 years. So I would say that those are some opportunities. We also have interns from the curatorial department, our history departments in the Bay Area. It's a little bit challenging, honestly, for us to work with interns because we have such little resources and such little time, and our culture of meetings is unbelievable. I would love us to institute what Sarah suggested of having meetings 3 days a week as an institution and really respecting the other 2 days for research. But as it is, as I look at my meeting today, yes. I have meetings from right now until 5:30, and that's practically every day. And so I think that this is something that if we could, as practitioners and museum people, institutional people, if we could start a small revolution, it would be wonderful. That would be the biggest thing we can do to help research.
I agree. I do like your comment about meetings being the enemy of research. I think we've all had that experience.
Yes.
But they do aid communication, which was the other thing we said is necessary. So I'm learning that our time is up.
Okay.
So what I want to do now is thank you both, Sarah and Lucía, for making the time to talk about this topic, which is so dear to our hearts. And thanks to AAMC for hosting. And I think we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for participating.